Before we dive into this wild story about how I ended up towing an entire neighborhood's worth of cars, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for how this all unfolds. Now, let me tell you how a simple storage space turned into an all-out suburban warfare. I never thought I'd become known as that guy in my neighborhood, but when you're pushed far enough, sometimes being that guy is exactly what needs to happen. My name is Marcus Chen, and until 6 months ago, I was just another homeowner in the Oakridge Gardens community, minding my own business and living what I thought was the American dream. You know how they say, no good deed goes unpunished? Well, my story is living proof of that. When I first bought my house in Oakridge Gardens 3 years ago, the main selling point wasn't just the craftsman-style architecture or the mature oak trees lining the streets. It was the massive detached garage, a beautiful 200 square foot structure with high ceilings, perfect for my home workshop and classic car restoration hobby. The previous owner had been an architect who'd custom built it with all the bells and whistles, climate control, upgraded electrical system, even a small bathroom. It was like finding a unicorn in the suburban wilderness. The real estate agent had made it crystal clear. The garage was private property, separately deeded from the HOA common areas. I'd specifically asked about this because I'd heard horror stories about HOAs trying to claim private structures. Everything checked out. The garage was mine, all mine, and I had the paperwork to prove it. I even had my lawyer review everything before signing. That's how much this space meant to me. For the first 2 years, everything was perfect. I spent my weekends restoring my 1967 Mustang, the sound of classic rock mixing with the whir of power tools. My neighbors would occasionally stop by to admire the progress, and I was happy to show off my work. I even helped Mr. Martinez from next door change his oil a few times. That's the kind of neighbor I was. Helpful, friendly, but clear about boundaries. Then everything changed when Diane Blackwood became the new HOA board president. Looking back, I should have seen the signs at that first community meeting. Diane had swept in with her vision for modernizing our community. She spoke about maximizing utility and shared resources with the practiced smoothness of a politician. I remember sitting there, halfway paying attention while scrolling through car parts on my phone, not realizing I was about to become the center of her grand plan. The first hint of trouble came in the form of a seemingly innocent email. "Dear Oakridge Gardens residents," it read, "we're excited to announce new community storage solutions." I almost deleted it, thinking it was just another HOA newsletter about garden gnome regulations or approved paint colors. But then I saw my address specifically mentioned. The email went on to explain how the HOA board had graciously arranged for residents to use available garage space for their overflow storage needs. My garage was described as a community asset that would now be part of a shared space initiative. They'd even included a schedule for residents to sign up for storage slots. I nearly choked on my coffee. They hadn't consulted me. They hadn't asked. They had just decided. My private property, my sanctuary, my workshop, they were treating it like a community storage unit. The email ended with a cheerful note about how this would boost property values and enhance community spirit. I immediately fired off a response, attaching copies of my property deed and reminding them that my garage was private property, not subject to HOA governance. I kept it professional, despite the anger bubbling under my surface. The response I received from Diane made my blood boil. "Dear Marcus," she wrote, her condescension practically dripping through the screen. "While we appreciate your perspective, the board has determined that all standalone structures must contribute to community welfare. Your cooperation in this matter will be noted in your resident compliance record." My resident compliance record? I didn't even know we had those. But what really got me was the underlying threat in her tone. It was subtle but clear. Play ball or face consequences. That evening, as I worked on my Mustang's transmission, I heard voices outside. Through the garage windows, I spotted Diane leading a group of residents around my property, gesturing at my garage like a real estate agent giving a tour. They were actually measuring the exterior and peeking through the windows. The audacity of it made my hands shake. I stepped outside, wiping grease off my hands with a rag. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Diane turned, flashing that politician's smile. "Oh, Marcus, perfect timing. We're just doing a space assessment for the storage initiative. Mrs. O'Donnell here needs room for her holiday decorations, and we thought the back corner of your garage would be perfect." I looked at Mrs. O'Donnell, an elderly woman who'd always been kind to me, then back at Diane. "This is private property," I said firmly. "You can't just decide to use it without my permission." "Now, Marcus," Diane's voice took on that patronizing tone I would come to hate, "we need to think about the greater good of the community. Your garage is far larger than a single resident needs. Sharing is caring, after all." "Not when it comes to private property," I countered. "I have the deed. This isn't up for discussion." That's when Diane showed her true colors. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes turned cold. "The board has already voted on this initiative, Marcus. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. You wouldn't want to find yourself in violation of community standards, would you?" As the group walked away, I heard Diane assuring them that everything would be sorted out soon. I stood there, watching them leave, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. This wasn't just about storage space anymore. This was about power, about control, and about someone trying to take what was rightfully mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Diane's threat and what it might mean. I'd heard stories about HOAs making homeowners' lives miserable. Endless fines, harassment, even forced sales. I wasn't about to let that happen to me. I needed to be smart about this, needed to document everything. I installed security cameras the next day, covering every angle of my garage and driveway. I dug out every piece of paperwork related to my property. I even started recording all my interactions with board members on my phone. I had a feeling I was going to need every bit of evidence I could get. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. In the coming weeks, I would learn exactly how far an HOA board would go to get their way, and just how much satisfaction there is in watching a tow truck haul away the cars of people who thought they could take what was mine. The morning after my confrontation with Diane Blackwood, I woke up to the sound of voices outside my garage. Through my kitchen window, I spotted 3 residents I didn't recognize standing in my driveway with tape measures and notebooks. They were actually sketching layout plans for my garage space, my private garage space. The audacity of it made my coffee taste bitter in my mouth. I threw on a jacket and headed outside, making sure to start recording on my phone the moment I stepped out the door. The trio jumped when they saw me, at least having the decency to look embarrassed. One of them, a man in an expensive-looking golf outfit, quickly tried to take control of the situation. "Good morning. You must be Marcus. I'm Richard Kensington, from the Community Planning Committee. We're just doing some preliminary measurements for the new storage initiative." His voice had that artificial cheerfulness that set my teeth on edge. "Diane mentioned you were on board after your discussion yesterday." I felt my jaw clench. "She mentioned wrong. This is private property, and you're trespassing. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I kept my voice level, professional, despite the anger bubbling underneath. Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Now, Marcus, there's no need to be difficult. The board has already allocated storage spaces to several residents. Mrs. Peterson here has already scheduled to move her antique furniture in next Tuesday." He gestured to a well-dressed woman who was still making notes on her tablet. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. They had already placed small numbered stickers on my garage door, marking out different sections. They were actually dividing up my property without my consent. Remove those stickers. Now. My voice had dropped to a dangerous quiet. And take lots of pictures of yourselves doing it, because if there's any damage to my property, you'll be paying for it. Mrs. Peterson finally looked up from her tablet, her expression a mix of confusion and indignation. But I've already hired movers. The HOA contract clearly states that all community resources must be made available for resident use. My garage isn't a community resource, I explained, fighting to maintain my composure. It's private property, separately deeded, not under HOA jurisdiction. And if any movers show up trying to access it, I'll have them charged with attempted breaking and entering. The third person, a younger man who had been quietly observing until now, stepped forward. I'm David Walsh, the board's legal consultant. Perhaps we could discuss this over coffee. Find some middle ground. His tone was conciliatory, but there was something calculating in his eyes that I didn't trust.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I pulled out my phone and pulled up the photos of my property deed. Here's all the middle ground you need. Private property, separately deeded, not under HOA jurisdiction. Take pictures if you want, but then I need you to leave. David glanced at the documents, his expression carefully neutral. We'll need to review this with the board. In the meantime, perhaps we could discuss a temporary arrangement. The community would be willing to compensate you for the use of the space. I almost laughed. They were trying to rent my private property from me without my consent. The answer is no. Remove the stickers and leave, or I call the police for trespassing. As they reluctantly peeled off their storage space markers, I noticed movement across the street. Diane Blackwood was standing on her front porch, watching the scene unfold with an expression I couldn't quite read. When she saw me looking, she didn't turn away. Instead, she raised her coffee mug in a mock toast, her smile never reaching her eyes. That afternoon, I received an email from the HOA board. The subject line read, "Notice of Emergency Community Meeting. Attendance mandatory." The meeting was scheduled for tomorrow evening at the community center. The agenda included items like discussion of community resource allocation and review of resident compliance standards. They weren't even trying to hide what this was about. I spent the rest of the day making calls. First to my lawyer, Michael Santos, who listened to the situation with increasing disbelief. They can't just declare your private property a community resource, he assured me, but document everything. Every email, every interaction, every attempt to access your property, and get those security cameras up yesterday. Next, I called my friend James, who worked for a local security company. By sunset, I had 8 high-definition cameras installed around my garage with motion sensors and direct feeds to my phone. I also changed all the locks, installing commercial-grade deadbolts that would make Fort Knox jealous. That evening, as I was reviewing the camera feeds on my laptop, I noticed a group of residents walking past my garage. They were pointing and discussing something, occasionally consulting their phones. I pulled up the HOA community app and found something that made my stomach turn. Someone had created a digital sign-up sheet for Community Storage Space B, complete with time slots and space allocations. They had even included photos of my garage interior, taken through the windows during their earlier inspection. I was documenting this latest violation when I heard a car door slam outside. Through the camera feed, I watched Ray Martinez, my usually friendly neighbor, attempting to open my garage side door. He had boxes in his arms and was clearly frustrated to find the door locked. I walked outside, making sure my security system was recording. "Ray, what are you doing?" He turned, looking slightly embarrassed but mostly annoyed. "Oh, Marcus, I signed up for the 7 to 8 p.m. slot to store some of Maria's old teaching supplies. The app said the door would be unlocked." I ran my hand through my hair, exhausted. "Ray, this is my private garage. The HOA has no right to tell people they can use it. They're putting you in a bad position by pretending they have that authority." Ray shifted uncomfortably. "Look, man, I get it's your garage, but the board voted. Diane showed us the community bylaws. All standalone structures are subject to community needs assessment. You can't just keep all this space to yourself when others need it." "That's exactly what I can do, because it's my property," I insisted. "Would you let the HOA decide that people could start using your spare bedroom for storage just because you live alone and have extra space?" "That's different," Ray argued, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. "This is a separate structure that I own, completely separately deeded." I pulled out my phone and showed him the property documents. "The HOA is lying to you, Ray. They're going to get people in legal trouble by encouraging them to try to access private property." As Ray read through the documents, his expression darkened. Diane said this had all been legally verified, that the board had the authority. "She lied," I said simply, "and I've got a feeling this isn't the first time." Ray left with his boxes, apologizing for the misunderstanding. But as I watched him walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this interaction was exactly what Diane wanted, to create tension between neighbors, to make me look like the unreasonable one. I spent most of the night reviewing the HOA bylaws, looking for anything they might try to use against me at tomorrow's meeting. The more I read, the more concerned I became. While they had no right to my garage, they had surprising authority over other aspects of property use. They could fine residents for virtually anything they deemed a violation of community standards. And those standards were vague enough to be dangerous. Around midnight, my security system alerted me to movement outside. On the camera feed, I watched 2 figures approaching my garage with flashlights. I was about to call the police when I recognized them. Kevin O'Donnell and his teenage son, trying to be subtle as they measured my garage doors. I hit the switch for the exterior floodlights, illuminating them like actors on a stage. They froze, flashlights still in hand. I used my phone to activate the outdoor speaker system I'd just installed. "This is private property. You're being recorded. Please leave immediately." They practically tripped over each other in their haste. "Do get away." But as they fled, I heard the son ask, "Dad, if it's his garage, why did Mrs. Blackwood give us the key?" A key. They had a key. Or at least they thought they did. I immediately called my locksmith, waking him up to arrange for another lock change first thing in the morning. Then I checked my camera's archived footage, scanning backward through the day. Sure enough, around noon, while I was on the phone with my lawyer, someone had tried a key in my garage door. The camera hadn't caught their face, but I had a pretty good idea who it was. I was still awake at 3 a.m. when another notification popped up on my phone. Someone had posted in the community forum, "Storage space B sign-up sheet updated. Please, note temporary delay in access. Alternate arrangements being made. Maintain scheduled slots." They weren't going to stop. This wasn't just about storage space anymore. This was about power, about control, about someone deciding they had the right to take what was mine and give it to others. And Diane Blackwood was just getting started. As I sat there in my dark kitchen, watching the night vision camera feeds and drinking coffee gone cold, I made a decision. They wanted to play games with property rights? Fine. I had a few games of my own in mind. And it was going to start with tomorrow's mandatory community meeting. I pulled up my email and started composing a message to my lawyer. The subject line read, "Need immediate restraining order preparation." Then I started making a list of every locksmith, towing company and security service in a 50-mile radius. Because if Diane Blackwood thought I was just going to roll over and let her turn my private property into a community storage free-for-all, she was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. The sun was rising by the time I finished my preparations. I stood at my kitchen window, watching early morning joggers pass by my garage, some of them slowing to peer at it with obvious interest. My phone buzzed with another community app notification. Reminder, emergency meeting tonight, 7 p.m. Attendance mandatory. Non-compliance will be noted. I allowed myself a small smile as I watched another neighbor drive by slowly, clearly measuring my garage with their eyes. They had no idea what was coming, but they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about respecting private property rights, and it was going to involve a whole fleet of tow trucks. The community center buzzed with tension as residents filed in for the emergency meeting. I arrived early, setting up my laptop to record everything, and chose a seat with a clear view of the board table. My lawyer's words echoed in my head. Don't lose your temper. Document everything. Let them dig their own hole. Patricia Whitmore, the HOA secretary, was arranging papers at the front of the room, occasionally glancing at me with poorly concealed nervousness. The rest of the board members filtered in, including David Walsh, the legal consultant who'd been measuring my garage that morning. He was deep in conversation with Diane Blackwood, both of them pointedly ignoring my presence. The meeting room quickly filled beyond capacity. I recognized faces from the storage space sign-up sheet, all of them deliberately avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Peterson, still clutching her tablet, was telling anyone who would listen about the antique furniture she'd have to keep in storage for another month. The air conditioning hummed ineffectively against the heat of too many bodies packed into too small a space. Diane called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. Thank you all for attending this emergency session. We have several pressing matters to discuss regarding community resource allocation and resident compliance. Her voice carried that same artificial sweetness that had become all too familiar. I activated my recording app just as Diane launched into her prepared speech. Oakridge Gardens has always prided itself on being more than just a neighborhood. We're a community, and in times of need, communities come together to support one another. Several heads nodded in agreement. I noticed Ray Martinez shift uncomfortably in his seat. It has come to the board's attention, Diane continued, that certain residents are refusing to participate in our new community storage initiative. This kind of selfish behavior goes against everything our community stands for. The word selfish hung in the air like a physical presence. I felt dozens of eyes turned toward me, but kept my expression neutral, fingers typing quietly as I documented every word. The board has reviewed our bylaws extensively. David Walsh stepped in, his law degree practically radiating from his pressed suit and carefully styled hair. Section 7, paragraph 3 clearly states that all community resources must be made available for the common good when deemed necessary by the board. I raised my hand, waiting to be acknowledged. Diane's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, Marcus. Could you please define community resources? I asked, keeping my voice level. Because private property, separately deeded and owned, doesn't fall under that category. David shuffled through his papers. The bylaws give the board broad discretionary powers to determine what constitutes a community resource in times of need. That's not actually an answer, I pointed out. You're claiming authority over private property based on a deliberate misinterpretation of the bylaws. I have documentation proving my garage is separately deeded and explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction. Before David could respond, Diane cut in. Marcus, your continued obstruction is disappointing. Mrs. Peterson has already paid movers to handle her antique furniture. Mr. O'Donnell needs space for his boat during the renovation. These are your neighbors, and they need your help. Then they can rent storage units, I replied calmly, just like everyone else in the world who needs extra storage space. You don't get to volunteer my private property for their convenience. A murmur ran through the crowd. I noticed a few thoughtful expressions, people beginning to question the board's logic. Diane's smile vanished entirely. Let's discuss your recent violations then, Marcus. Your security cameras are not approved installations. The new locks weren't submitted for architectural review, and your continued obstruction of community initiatives violates Section 12 of the bylaws. I pulled out my folder of documents. I have here the original property documents showing my garage is exempt from architectural review. I also have documentation of multiple trespassing attempts on my property, including unauthorized key copying and attempted forced entry. Would you like to discuss those? The room grew very quiet. David Walsh was suddenly very interested in his phone. Additionally, I continued, I have evidence that the board has been encouraging residents to access private property without owner consent. That's not just a violation of HOA bylaws. It's illegal. No one has illegally accessed anything, Diane snapped, her composure cracking. The board has full authority. To trespass, I interrupted, to create duplicate keys without property owner consent, to encourage residents to enter private property. Would you like me to play the security footage of last night's attempted entry? Or should we discuss the liability issues of the board, telling residents they can store items in a property they have no legal right to access? The room erupted in confused chatter. I noticed several residents deleting the storage space app from their phones. This meeting is not about legal semantics, Diane declared, banging her gavel. This is about community spirit and cooperation. Actually, I stood up, connecting my laptop to the projector. Let's talk about community spirit. Let's discuss how the board has been misrepresenting its authority and potentially exposing residents to legal liability. The screen filled with my property deed, highlighted sections clearly showing my garage's separate status. Everyone who signed up for storage space access should know that entering my garage would legally constitute breaking and entering. The board cannot authorize access to private property they don't control. If anyone had stored items in my garage based on the board's false claims of authority, and those items were damaged, their insurance would likely deny any claims because they had no legal right to store items there in the first place. Mrs. Peterson's face went pale, but the board said they had legal authority. The board lied, I stated simply, and they've been lying about other things too. Would anyone like to see the security footage of board members attempting to copy my garage keys without consent? Or should we discuss the potential legal liability of board members encouraging residents to commit criminal trespass? David Walsh stood up abruptly. This meeting is suspended pending legal review. No further discussion of the storage initiative will take place without proper legal consultation. Sit down, David, Diane ordered, but he was already gathering his papers. You've exposed the HOA to significant liability, he hissed at her, not quite quietly enough. We need to contain this immediately. The room descended into chaos. Residents were demanding answers, some angrily confronting board members about potential legal exposure. Patricia Whitmore was frantically trying to gather up all copies of the storage space agreements. Through it all, Diane stood at her podium, gavel forgotten in her hand, watching her authority crumble. When her eyes met mine, I saw something dangerous flash across her face. I packed up my laptop as the meeting devolved further. Ray Martinez caught up with me in the parking lot. Marcus, man, I had no idea, he said, running a hand through his hair. If we had known the garage wasn't actually under HOA control. The board counted on people not checking, I replied. They're exploiting everyone's trust. Ray glanced back at the community center, where raised voices could still be heard. Diane's not going to let this go. You know that, right? I nodded. I know. That's why I've got a few more surprises ready. Driving home, I noticed Diane's car following me. She wasn't even trying to be subtle about it. When I pulled into my driveway, she parked across the street, watching as I walked to my front door. I turned to face her. Would you like to add stalking to the list of documented violations? She got out of her car, her heels clicking on the pavement as she approached. You have no idea what you've done, she said, her voice quiet but intense. This community functions because people cooperate, because they understand their place in the hierarchy. No, I corrected her. It functions because people follow the actual rules, not your made-up version of them. You don't get to claim authority you don't have. She stepped closer, entering my property despite everything that had just happened at the meeting. There are other ways to enforce community standards, Marcus. Ways that don't require board approval. Ways that make people understand the natural order of things. Are you threatening me? I asked, making sure my security cameras caught every moment. Her smile returned, cold and artificial. Of course not. I'm simply reminding you that actions have consequences, and some consequences don't require official channels. As if on cue, a group of residents pulled up to my garage. Without even acknowledging my presence, they began unloading boxes from their cars. What do you think you're doing? I demanded. Oh! Diane's voice dripped with false concern. It seems some residents might have misunderstood the outcome of tonight's meeting. How unfortunate that you'll have to deal with this confusion. Repeatedly. Community misunderstandings can be so tedious to resolve. I watched as more cars arrived, more residents approaching my garage with storage items, all of them steadfastly ignoring my presence. You're orchestrating a harassment campaign, I stated flatly. You do realize how many laws that violates? She shrugged elegantly. I'm not orchestrating anything. I'm simply observing concerned residents attempting to access community resources they were promised. If you choose to deny them access to their storage spaces, well, that's your choice. Just like it's their choice to continue attempting to access what they believe they have a right to use. As she walked away, I counted 6 cars parked. Around my garage, their owners persistently trying doors and windows, some of them calling out that their storage slot time was being wasted. I pulled out my phone and began making calls. First to the police, reporting criminal trespassing in progress, then to my lawyer, updating him on the evolution of the harassment, and finally to Big Mike's 24-hour towing service. How many trucks do you have available? I asked, watching as even more cars arrived. Because I'm about to make your week very, very profitable. The night was just beginning, and so was my response to Diane's escalation. She thought she could wear me down with persistent harassment. She was about to learn exactly how expensive that strategy would become for her supporters. Big Mike turned out to be surprisingly small for his name, but his fleet of tow trucks was exactly what I needed. Within 20 minutes of my call, the first truck rolled up, yellow lights painting the growing crowd of residents in surreal flashes. The driver, a weathered man named Carl, took one look at the situation and immediately started radioing for in backup, private property violation, multiple vehicles, possible hostile crowd, he reported into his radio. Gonna need at least 3 more trucks and maybe police presence. The residents who had been trying to access my garage suddenly found themselves scrambling as Carl began positioning his truck. Mrs. Peterson, still clutching her tablet like a shield, approached me with panic in her eyes. Marcus, please, we can talk about this. My movers are coming tomorrow morning. I've already paid the deposit. I've been talking, I replied calmly. I've been explaining for days that this is private property. Now you're all trespassing and your vehicles are illegally parked on my property. Kevin O'Donnell, who had been documenting everything with his phone, stepped forward. The HOA approved this storage space. You can't just tow everyone's cars. Actually, I can, and I will. The HOA has no authority over my private property, as was clearly demonstrated at the meeting. You're all here illegally, and your vehicles are being towed at owner's expense. The crowd's murmuring turned angry. Someone shouted about calling the police. Already done, I announced, holding up my phone. They're on their way, along with my lawyer. Would anyone like to explain to them why you're trying to break into private property based on fraudulent claims by the HOA board? The first car lifted onto Carl's truck belonged to Richard Kensington, the Community Planning Committee member who had been measuring my garage without permission. The look on his face as his BMW was secured onto the flatbed was almost worth all the harassment I'd endured. 3 more tow trucks arrived just as the first police car pulled up. Officer Martinez, no relation to my neighbor Ray, had dealt with HOA disputes before, and his expression suggested he was already tired of this one. "What's the situation here?" he asked, though the answer was pretty obvious from the crowd of angry residents and the tow truck systematically removing vehicles. I handed him my property documents and security footage. These individuals are attempting to access my private property without permission, based on fraudulent claims by the HOA board. I've documented multiple instances of attempted trespassing and harassment. As if on cue, Diane Blackwood's car pulled up. She emerged like a general surveying a battlefield, her expression darkening at the sight of the tow trucks. "This is a community dispute that should be handled internally," she announced, striding toward Officer Martinez. "There's no need for police involvement." "There is when you're encouraging residents to commit criminal trespass," I countered. "Officer, I have evidence of the HOA board attempting to duplicate my garage keys without permission and organizing a harassment campaign." Diane's composure slipped for just a moment. "We have board authority to access community storage spaces." "This isn't a community storage space," Officer Martinez interrupted, reviewing my documentation. "This is private property, separately deeded. The HOA has no authority here." More police cars arrived as the situation escalated. The tow truck drivers worked efficiently, removing vehicle after vehicle. Some residents, seeing the writing on the wall, began moving their cars voluntarily. Others stood their ground, demanding the police stop the towing. "Your cars are illegally parked on private property," Officer Martinez explained to the angry crowd. "The property owner has the right to have them towed. If you believe you were misled by the HOA board, that's a separate civil matter." Patricia Whitmore pushed through the crowd, waving papers. "We have documentation. Board approval for the Community Storage Initiative." "Board approval doesn't override private property rights," I pointed out. "You can't vote to use something you don't own or control." The night air filled with the sound of tow truck winches and angry voices. My security cameras captured everything. The confrontations, the accusations, the moment Richard Kensington tried to unchain his BMW from the tow truck, only to be warned about tampering with equipment. Through it all, Diane stood watching, her expression growing darker with each vehicle removed. When my lawyer arrived, she tried to prevent him from reaching me, insisting this was an internal HOA matter. "Internal HOA matters don't include criminal trespass or harassment," Michael Santos replied, brushing past her. He surveyed the scene with professional interest. "This is quite the evidence-gathering opportunity. Multiple witnesses, documented trespassing attempts, clear proof of organized harassment." More residents arrived, drawn by frantic phone calls and community app updates. The crowd swelled, divided between those demanding their storage rights and those realizing just how badly the board had misled them. Ray Martinez pushed through the crowd, looking bewildered. "Marcus, the community forum is blowing up. People are talking about suing the board for legal expenses and towing costs." "They should," Michael interjected. The board knowingly misrepresented their authority and exposed residents to legal liability. Each person who attempts to access private property based on the board's fraudulent claims could face criminal charges. That got people's attention. The crowd's anger began to shift direction, turning toward Diane and the board members present. Questions about legal liability and misrepresentation grew louder. The board will cover any expenses incurred by residents following approved community initiatives, Diane announced, trying to regain control of the situation. Will it? I asked loudly. Does the HOA have funds to cover thousands in towing fees, legal expenses, and potential criminal defense costs? Because encouraging people to commit criminal trespass isn't typically covered by HOA insurance. David Walsh, who had been quietly observing from the periphery, suddenly looked very concerned. He pulled Diane aside, speaking urgently in hushed tones. I didn't need to hear them to know he was explaining just how legally exposed they were. Mrs. Peterson approached me again, this time with tears in her eyes. I can't afford these towing fees. The board said this was all legal, that we had every right to use the storage space. The board lied, I said simply, and now everyone's paying the price for trusting them. Maybe it's time for new leadership. Those words carried through the crowd, murmurs of agreement mixed with angry demands for emergency board elections. Patricia Whitmore was already backing away, clearly wanting no part of the growing chaos. Officer Martinez approached me as the last car was being towed. We've documented everything for the report. You might want to consider a restraining order against the board members, given the pattern of harassment. Already in process, Michael confirmed, along with civil suits for damages and criminal complaints for the attempted key duplication. Diane's voice cut through the night air. This isn't over, Marcus. The community will remember who caused all this trouble. The community will remember who lied to them, exposed them to legal liability, and cost them thousands in towing. Fees, I corrected. How many votes do you think you'll get in the next board election after this? The crowd had thinned considerably now that most of their vehicles were gone. The remaining residents were taking photos of my property documents, particularly the sections proving the garage wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. Michael stayed until the last tow truck pulled away. They'll try to retaliate through official channels now. Expect sudden findings of rule violations, arbitrary fines, that sort of thing. Let them try, I replied. Everything they do just adds to our documentation of harassment and abuse of power. As the night finally quieted, I stood in my driveway watching the last police car leave. The security cameras caught Diane making one final pass in her car, her headlights sweeping across my garage like searchlights. Ray approached, shaking his head. You know she's going to make your life hell now. She already tried that, I said. How'd it work out for her? The thing is, Ray continued, people are starting to ask questions about other board decisions now, like that special assessment for the clubhouse renovation that never happened, and the maintenance contracts that always seem to go to companies connected to board members. I smiled. Sounds like tonight opened a lot of eyes. Maybe, Ray agreed, but Diane's got a lot of power in this community and she's not used to losing. As if to emphasize his point, my phone buzzed with a new notification. The HOA had just sent out an emergency notice. Effective immediately, all exterior security cameras must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Unapproved installations must be removed within 24 hours or fines will be assessed. I showed the notice to Ray. See? Predictable. What are you going to do? Add it to the harassment documentation, I replied. And maybe look into just how many other residents have been bullied by this board. Something tells me we're going to find a lot of interesting stories. The next morning, my security cameras captured board members photographing every inch of my property, presumably looking for violations, but they weren't the only ones taking pictures. Other residents were documenting the board's actions, sharing them in newly created community groups with names like HOA Oversight and Oakridge Gardens Truth. Diane had wanted to teach me a lesson about community power. Instead, she had taught the entire neighborhood about the importance of standing up to abuse of authority, and this was just the beginning. Because while she was busy planning her next move, I was preparing something that would shake the very foundation of her power base. Sometimes the best way to deal with a broken system is to let everyone see exactly how broken it is. Morning brought a symphony of car alarms as residents discovered their vehicles clustered in the Big Mike's towing impound lot, racking up fees by the hour. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since sunrise, a mix of angry messages, desperate pleas, and surprisingly, several quiet words of support from neighbors who'd grown tired of the board's overreach. I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the latest batch of violation notices that had appeared in my mailbox. According to the HOA board, I was now in violation of 17 different community standards, ranging from unapproved security modifications to creating a hostile community environment. Each violation carried a substantial fine, due immediately. Michael Santos, my lawyer, answered on the first ring when I called. Let me guess. They're trying to drown you in fines. 17 violations overnight, I confirmed. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore. Perfect, Michael replied, and I could hear him typing. Each fraudulent violation adds to our case for harassment. Have you checked your email? I sent you something interesting about Diane Blackwood's history with other HOA boards. I opened my laptop and found Michael's email. The attachments revealed a pattern. Diane had served on 3 other HOA boards in the past decade, each time leaving amid controversies over financial management and abuse of power. But it was the last attachment that really caught my attention. She was removed from the Riverside Gardens board for misappropriation of funds, I asked, scanning the legal documents. Keep reading, Michael urged. Notice who handled the construction contracts during her tenure. The company name jumped out at me, Blackwood Enterprises, LLC, the same company that had mysteriously won every major maintenance contract in Oakridge Gardens since Diane became board president. A knock at my door interrupted my research. Through the security camera, I saw Patricia Whitmore shifting nervously on my porch, clutching a thick folder to her chest. She looked over her shoulder twice before knocking again. I opened the door, but stayed in the doorway, blocking entrance. Can I help you? I need to show you something, Patricia whispered, glancing around again. But not here. And you didn't get it from me. Why don't we talk in my garage? I suggested, watching. Her eyes widen at the irony. Inside my supposedly community-accessible garage, Patricia laid out the contents of her folder on my workbench. Financial records, board meeting minutes, contract bids, all carefully organized and annotated. I've been keeping copies, she explained, her hands trembling slightly. At first it was just to protect myself, but then I started noticing patterns. The way certain contracts always went to specific companies, even when other bids were lower. The special assessments that never seemed to match the actual work done. I picked up a document showing the bids for last year's landscaping contract. The winning bid from Green Valley Services was nearly double the others. A quick search on my phone revealed that Green Valley Services was registered to Diane's nephew. Why are you showing me this now? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Patricia's voice dropped even lower. Last night, after everything, with the towing, Diane called an emergency board meeting at her house. She's planning to push through a special assessment, $5,000 per household for critical infrastructure improvements. The contracts are already drawn up, all going to companies I've tracked back to her family members or business associates. I leaned against my workbench, letting this sink in. That's over $1 million from the community. And that's not all, Patricia continued, pulling out more documents. She's also proposing new bylaws that would give the board direct control over any underutilized private structures in the community. Your garage was just the test case. She wants to be able to claim authority over any private property she decides isn't being used properly. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about storage space or petty power plays. This was organized fraud on a massive scale. Why didn't you say something sooner? Patricia's shoulders slumped. I was afraid. Diane knows things about everyone in this community. She keeps files. When people challenge her, bad things happen. Just ask the Hendersons. The family that moved away suddenly last year? Patricia nodded. They found code violations every day for weeks. Their children were banned from the community pool for disruptive behavior. Their guests' cars were towed. Eventually, they couldn't take it anymore and sold at a loss to a company owned by Diane's brother-in-law. A car door slammed outside. Through the garage windows, I saw David Walsh walking up my driveway, his usual polished appearance slightly disheveled. He's been looking for me, Patricia whispered, gathering her documents. The board's in damage control mode. They're trying to contain this before people start asking too many questions about where their money's been going. I helped her slip out the back door of the garage just as David knocked on the front. When I opened it, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. We need to talk about resolution options, he said, trying to step inside. I blocked his path. We can talk here. Everything's being recorded anyway. David's jaw tightened. The board is prepared to waive all current violations and fines in exchange for your cooperation with the Community Storage Initiative. Additionally, we can offer you a reduced rate on your HOA dues for the next year. Not interested. Don't be hasty, he pressed. The alternative is years of costly legal battles. Even if you win, the process itself will be exhausting. The board has significant resources at its disposal. You mean the resources it's been gathering through fraudulent contracts and inflated special assessments? David's expression flickered for just a moment. That's a serious accusation. One that could result in legal consequences if made publicly, without evidence. You mean evidence like the kind Patricia's been collecting, or the kind my lawyer is currently reviewing? How many kickbacks have you personally received for rubber stamping Diane's contracts, David? The color drained from his face. I don't know what you think you have. I think I have enough to warrant a forensic audit of the HOA's books. I think I have enough to interest the district attorney's office in how community funds have been managed. And I think you're here because Diane sent you to contain the situation before it spirals completely out of her control. David tugged at his collar, sweat visible despite the morning chill. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. Come to an arrangement that benefits everyone. You mean like the arrangement with the Hendersons? Force them out, buy low through shell companies, sell high to new residents who don't know any better? Those are complicated situations. They're fraud, I interrupted. And now there's a paper trail. I wonder how many other HOA boards Diane's pulled this scheme with. My lawyer's looking into that too. David's professional demeanor cracked. Completely. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Diane has connections. She can make things very difficult. More difficult than having residents' cars towed. More difficult than 17 fraudulent violations overnight. Or are you talking about the kind of difficulties that come with criminal investigations into financial fraud? A new car pulled into my driveway, Ray Martinez's pickup truck. He wasn't alone. Kevin O'Donnell and 3 other residents emerged, all carrying folders similar to Patricia's. More evidence? I asked Ray as the group approached. Turns out Patricia wasn't the only one keeping records, Ray replied. Kevin here used to work in forensic accounting before he retired. He's been tracking some interesting patterns in our HOA fees. David Walsh looked like he might be sick. Without another word, he turned and quickly walked to his car, phone already pressed to his ear. Kevin watched him leave, then turned to me. We've been going through old records all night. The storage space scheme wasn't just about control. It was about forcing people out. Every time someone stands up to the board, suddenly their property becomes necessary for community use. They either submit or get harassed until they leave. And then Diane's shell companies swoop in to buy the property at below market rates. I finished. Ray dropped his folder on my workbench. We found 7 different companies, all tied back to Diane or her family members. They've bought 4 properties in Oakridge Gardens in the last 2 years alone, all from residents who left. After prolonged disputes with the board, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Emergency notice, special assessment vote tonight, attendance mandatory." "Right on schedule," I muttered, showing them the email. Diane's pushing for her $1 million infrastructure improvement project before she loses control of the narrative. Kevin smiled grimly. She doesn't know we've already contacted the State Attorney General's office, or that we have documents showing how she's used the same scheme in other communities. How long until they can act on it? That's the thing, Ray interjected. They need more evidence of current fraudulent activity, something concrete that shows the pattern continuing. I looked at the email again, at the detailed breakdown of proposed contracts, all coincidentally going to companies we now knew were connected to Diane. Then let's give them what they need. Tonight's emergency meeting just became a sting operation. The community center hummed with nervous energy as residents filed in for the emergency assessment vote. This time, I wasn't alone. Michael Santos sat beside me, laptop open, while Kevin O'Donnell and his impromptu forensic accounting team scattered themselves strategically throughout the room. Ray Martinez had positioned himself near the podium, phone ready to record. State investigators, posing as new residents, sat quietly in the back row, their presence unknown to the board members who were frantically shuffling papers at the front table. Patricia Whitmore's hands shook as she arranged the voting ballots, carefully avoiding Diane Blackwood's sharp glare. "Something's off," Ray whispered, nodding toward the entrance. "Look who's here." Jason Reynolds, Diane's brother-in-law and owner of multiple shell companies we'd identified, strode in wearing an expensive suit and an air of artificial confidence. He took a seat directly behind the board table, laptop open, fingers hovering over the keys. "He's never attended a meeting before," Kevin murmured. "Not once in 3 years." Michael Santos made a note on his legal pad. "The state's financial crimes unit will be very interested in that detail." Diane called the meeting to order, her voice carrying its usual artificial sweetness. "Thank you all for attending this crucial session. As your board president, it's my duty to inform you of urgent infrastructure needs that require immediate attention." The projector flickered to life, displaying a spreadsheet of proposed improvements. The total at the bottom, $1, $2 million, caused a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "Our expert contractors have identified critical issues that must be addressed," Diane continued, gesturing to a stack of professional-looking reports. "The special assessment of $5,000 per household will ensure our community's safety and property values." I raised my hand, waiting to be acknowledged. Diane's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Marcus? Could you tell us about the bidding process for these contracts?" "All contracts were competitively bid according to board procedures," she replied smoothly. "The winning bids provided the best value for our community." "Interesting," I said, opening my own laptop, "because I have documents showing that Green Valley Services, which won the $300,000 landscaping contract, was only incorporated 3 months ago. Their office address is a UPS store, and their only employee is your nephew who has no landscaping experience. The room went silent. Jason Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Furthermore, I continued, Riverside Construction, slated for the $450,000 drainage project, shares a tax ID number with Blackwood Enterprises LLC. That's your company, isn't it, Diane? David Walsh jumped to his feet. These accusations are inappropriate for— Sit down, David, Michael Santos interrupted. Unless you'd like to explain your own connection to Summit Property Management, which has mysteriously acquired 4 homes in this community after their owners were harassed into selling. Diane's composure cracked for just a moment. These baseless accusations are documented in detail, Kevin O'Donnell announced, standing up. As a forensic accountant, I've been tracking the money flow through this HOA for months. Would you like me to share my findings about the last 3 special assessments? Or should we discuss the shell companies registered to your family members? Patricia Whitmore suddenly pushed back from the board table. I have something to say. Patricia, Diane warned, remember your position. My position. Patricia's voice trembled but grew stronger. My position is secretary of this HOA, and I've documented every fraudulent contract, every inflated bid, every shell company deal for the past 2 years. She pulled out a USB drive. This contains every email, every document, every piece of evidence, showing how this board has been stealing from our community. And I've already provided copies to the relevant authorities. Jason Reynolds slammed his laptop shut and stood up. This meeting is over. No votes will be taken tonight. Sit down, Mr. Reynolds, a voice called from the back. One of the state. Investigators stood up, badge in hand. Financial Crimes Unit, we have some questions about your real estate holdings. The room erupted in chaos. David Walsh made a dash for the door but was stopped by another investigator. Diane remained frozen at the podium, watching as her carefully constructed scheme collapsed around her. This is what happens, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, when you try to steal my garage. Ray Martinez let out a low whistle. Man, you really started a domino effect here. She started it, I corrected him. I just finished it. Over the next 2 hours, state investigators conducted preliminary interviews while residents shared their own stories of board harassment and financial manipulation. The pattern was clear. Any resident who challenged the board's authority found themselves targeted with violations and fines until they sold their property, usually at a loss, to one of Diane's shell companies. Mrs. Peterson approached me, tears in her eyes. They told me I had to sell last month. Said my property had too many violations to fix. I was going to lose my home of 20 years to some company called Summit Properties. Not anymore, Michael assured her. We'll be filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of all affected residents. The state's investigation will freeze any pending property transfers. Diane Blackwood sat alone at the board table watching as her empire crumbled. When the investigators finally approached her, she maintained her artificial smile. This is all a misunderstanding, she began. Save it for your arraignment, the lead investigator cut her off. We've been building this case for months. Mr. Chen's garage situation just gave us the perfect opportunity to catch you in the act. I turned to Michael. Months? He nodded. Kevin contacted them 3 months ago with his initial findings. They needed clear evidence of ongoing fraud, not just past actions. Your garage dispute gave them the perfect opportunity to document the board's current illegal activities. Patricia approached, still shaking but standing taller. I have something else you should see. She handed me a folder. Records of similar schemes in 3 other communities. Same pattern: create disputes over private property, force sales through harassment, buy low through shell companies, sell high to new residents. The lead investigator took the folder. This explains a lot of cold cases we've been looking at. HOA fraud is hard to prove without clear documentation of ongoing patterns. Ray Martinez clapped me on the shoulder. So, your garage basically brought down a whole criminal enterprise. More like exposed it, I corrected. All these people keeping records, gathering evidence. They just needed a catalyst. Speaking of catalysts, Michael interjected, we should discuss the civil suits. A lot of residents will want to recover their losses. I watched as Diane was escorted out by investigators, her perfect composure finally cracking. Jason Reynolds and David Walsh were already in custody, along with 2 other board members implicated in the scheme. Kevin O'Donnell approached with a thick stack of documents. We found something else. Remember those infrastructure improvements they kept assessing us for? Most of the work was never done. They just shuffled the money through shell companies and pocketed it. How much are we talking about? Preliminary estimate: over $3 million in the past 5 years, and that's just this community. The remaining residents had formed groups, sharing stories and comparing notes about their experiences with the board. The atmosphere had shifted from tension to relief, from fear to determination for justice. Mrs. Peterson touched my arm gently. "Thank you," she said softly, "not just for stopping them, but for showing us we could stand up to them." I smiled. "All I did was protect my garage. You all did the hard work of documenting everything." Ray Martinez grinned. "Yeah, but you gave us the perfect opportunity to use all that documentation. Who knew a private garage could cause so much trouble?" "Speaking of trouble," Michael interrupted, "we should discuss the recovery of towing fees for everyone affected by last night's incident. I think we can add that to the civil suit against the board members personally." As the meeting finally wound down, I stood in the parking lot watching residents leave with renewed hope. My phone buzzed with a message from the state investigator. "Need your full statement tomorrow. This case is bigger than we thought. Multiple jurisdictions involved." Ray joined me, shaking his head in amazement. "So what happens now?" "Now," I smiled, "now we elect a new board, one that actually serves the community instead of stealing from it. And maybe we set up some better oversight systems." "And your garage?" "My garage goes back to being just a garage, a private garage, where I can work on my car in peace." As if to emphasize the point, a tow truck rolled past, carrying David Walsh's luxury SUV toward the impound lot. Some lessons about respecting private property are more expensive than others. Morning light filtered through the blinds of the local police station's interview room as I sat across from Detective Sarah Chen, no relation, who specialized in financial crimes. The wall behind her was covered in flowcharts linking shell companies, property transfers, and board members across multiple communities. "Your garage dispute opened up a hornet's nest," Detective Chen remarked, adding another red string to connect Summit Properties to one of Diane's relatives. "We've identified similar patterns in 6 other communities across 3 counties. The total fraud could exceed $10 million. Michael Santos, my lawyer, whistled softly beside me, and it all started because they tried to commandeer private property. "That's what makes this case unique," Detective Chen explained, spreading out photographs of various properties. "In other communities, they typically targeted vulnerable homeowners, elderly residents, single parents, people who couldn't afford prolonged legal battles. But you had documentation, security cameras, and the resources to fight back." A knock at the door interrupted us. Kevin O'Donnell entered, carrying several thick folders. His transition from retired resident to key witness in a major fraud investigation had energized him, bringing back his forensic accounting expertise with a vengeance. "Found something interesting in the electronic records," he announced, laying out spreadsheets. Every time they forced a resident to sell, the property was purchased by one of their shell companies for about 60% of market value. 3 months later, it would sell to a new resident at full price, sometimes higher. But here's the clever part. They used HOA funds to renovate these properties between purchases. Detective Chen leaned forward. They were using community money to flip houses they acquired through harassment. Exactly, Kevin confirmed. They'd approve special assessments for community improvements, divert the funds to their properties, then sell at a massive profit. The new owners would never know they were buying houses obtained through fraud. My phone buzzed with a news alert. The local paper had picked up the story. HOA board arrested in multi-million-dollar property. Fraud scheme. Below the headline was a photo of Diane Blackwood being escorted from the community center in handcuffs, still maintaining her artificial smile. "We've got reporters asking for interviews," Michael noted. "Might be worth considering. Public exposure could help identify more victims." Before I could respond, Ray Martinez burst into the room out of breath. "You need to see this. Now!" He pulled up the community web portal on his tablet. The screen filled with angry posts from residents who had just discovered their homes were involved in the fraud scheme. Properties bought through Summit Properties, Riverside Holdings, and other shell companies had all been purchased under suspicious circumstances. "People are panicking," Ray explained. "Some are talking about their mortgages being based on fraudulent sales. Others are worried about their property values tanking when this hits the news." Detective Chen straightened. "We need to get ahead of this, Mr. Santos. Can you draft a statement explaining how the investigation will protect legitimate homeowners?" Michael was already typing on his laptop. "On it. We'll emphasize that current residents who purchased in good faith aren't legally at risk. The fraud charges target the board members and their shell companies, not the property transfers themselves." Another officer entered with a fresh stack of evidence bags. "Found these in Diane Blackwood's home office. Detailed files on every resident in Oakridge Gardens, personal information, financial records, surveillance photos. I recognize some of the photos, residents checking their mail, working in their yards, coming and going from their homes. The level of surveillance was disturbing. She kept blackmail material," Detective Chen explained, examining the files. "Anything she could use as leverage if residents started asking questions. Affairs, financial troubles, family disputes, all meticulously documented." Ray picked up a file with his name on it. His face darkened as he read. "She knew about my daughter's learning disability. Was planning to use it against me if I opposed the special assessment. Claimed she could have the community pool rules changed to exclude disruptive children." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. This wasn't just financial fraud. It was systematic emotional manipulation and exploitation of vulnerable residents. A commotion in the hallway drew our attention. Through the open door, we saw Patricia Whitmore being escorted to another interview room, clutching a laptop to her chest. She had spent the night copying every electronic record she could access before the board's computers were seized. "Found the smoking gun," she announced as she passed our door. "Emails between Diane and developers discussing which properties to target next. They were planning to force out an entire block of original homeowners to build luxury townhouses." Detective Chen excused herself to join Patricia's interview. As soon as she left, Kevin spread out more financial records on the table. "Look at this pattern," he pointed to a series of transactions. Every time they forced a sale, they also imposed special assessments on the remaining residents. The harassment campaign generated profit twice, once from the undervalued property purchase, and again from the fraudulent improvement fees. Michael made notes for the civil suit. "Class action keeps looking better. We might be able to recover most of the stolen funds through asset seizure." My phone buzzed again, a message from Mrs. Peterson. Emergency resident meeting at my house. People need answers. Can you come? I showed the message to Ray and Kevin. We should go. People are scared and angry. They need to understand what's happening. The drive to Mrs. Peterson's house revealed a neighborhood in turmoil. Clusters of residents stood in driveways and on front lawns, gesturing animatedly as they discussed the revelations. News vans had already started appearing, reporters eager to cover the story of affluent suburbia's dark underbelly. Mrs. Peterson's living room was packed when we arrived. The fear in the air was palpable as residents shared stories of their interactions with the board, each account revealing new layers of manipulation and control. My son was banned from the tennis courts last year, one resident revealed, said he was too disruptive. Now I find out it was because I questioned the landscaping contract at a board meeting. Another resident, an elderly man I'd never met, spoke up. They cited me for yard violations every week until I agreed to sell my east lot to Summit Properties. Said it was for community improvements. Now, I know they just wanted to flip it. I stood up, drawing their attention. I know everyone's worried, but the investigation is going to protect legitimate homeowners. The fraud charges target the board members and their shell companies, not your property rights. What about the special assessments? Someone called. Out. We've paid thousands for improvements that never happened. Kevin took that one. We're documenting every fraudulent assessment. The civil suit will seek recovery of all stolen funds. Plus, with asset seizure from the shell companies, there's a good chance of recovering most of the money. A young mother bounced a fussy baby on her hip. What happens to the HOA now? We still need basic services. Landscaping, pool maintenance, security. Ray Martinez stepped forward. We form an interim board, transparent with proper oversight. No more secret meetings, no more hidden agendas, everything in the open. The discussion continued for hours as residents worked through their shock and anger. Gradually, fear gave way to determination. People volunteered for committees, offered professional expertise, and started organizing to rebuild their community's governance from the ground up. As the meeting wound down, Mrs. Peterson pulled me aside. You know what really gets me? All this started because they tried to steal your garage. If they'd just respected private property rights, their whole scheme might still be running. I smiled. Sometimes the biggest houses of cards fall because of one misplaced piece. Outside, the news vans had multiplied. Reporters waited eagerly for resident interviews, hungry for sound bites about betrayal and corruption in suburban paradise. My phone buzzed one last time that evening. A message from Detective Chen. Found something else in Diane's files. Plans for similar schemes in 3 other communities. This is going federal. Hope you're ready for more interviews. I looked up at my garage, still standing quiet and untouched. Security cameras keeping their vigilant watch. From such a simple thing, the defense of private property rights, had come the unraveling of a criminal enterprise that had preyed on communities for years. Ray joined me in my driveway. You know what's ironic? If they hadn't gotten greedy about your garage, if they just stuck to their usual tactics of targeting vulnerable residents, they might have gotten away with it forever. That's the thing about bullies, I replied. They get used to people backing down. When someone finally stands up to them, they don't know how to handle it. Across the street, residents were organizing a community watch program determined to prevent future abuses of power. The HOA's reign of terror had ended, but its aftermath would reshape how these suburban communities governed themselves for years to come. And it all started with a garage. My garage. Sometimes the biggest changes come from standing firm on the smallest principles. The federal courthouse loomed over us, its modernist architecture a stark contrast to the suburban comfort of Oakridge Gardens. FBI Special Agent Maria Torres led our group through security. her no-nonsense demeanor setting the tone for what promised to be an intense day of testimony. The Bureau's White-Collar Crimes Division has been tracking similar HOA fraud schemes across 6 states, she explained, as we rode the elevator to the grand jury chamber. Your case connected a lot of dots we'd been trying to link for years. Kevin O'Donnell clutched his briefcase of financial records, his forensic accountant's mind already dissecting the broader implications. The pattern was brilliant in its simplicity. Target affluent communities where residents are too busy to scrutinize board activities closely. Patricia Whitmore nodded, her former nervousness replaced by quiet determination. Create artificial disputes, force property sales, flip houses using community funds, then repeat. Nobody ever looked at the bigger picture until now. The elevator doors opened to reveal a scene of controlled chaos. Attorneys hurried through corridors while federal agents conferred in hushed tones. Through a nearby door, I glimpsed Diane Blackwood sitting with her defense team, her usual polished appearance somewhat diminished by weeks in federal custody. Mr. Chen, a tall man in an impeccable suit, approached. I'm AUSA William Harrison, lead prosecutor. Your testimony today could help us unravel similar schemes across the country. Are you ready? Before I could answer, a commotion erupted near the courthouse entrance. Through the glass doors, we watched as federal agents led Jason Reynolds away from a group of angry residents who had followed him from the parking lot. That's the 3rd confrontation this morning, Agent Torres sighed. As news of the scheme spreads, we're getting reports from communities all over the state. People are finally connecting the dots about suspicious property transfers and abusive board practices. Michael Santos appeared carrying fresh documents. Just got the preliminary asset seizure report. They've identified over 40 shell companies, hundreds of properties, and offshore accounts in 3 countries. This is way bigger than we thought. We were ushered into a conference room where assistant U.S. attorneys were mapping out the conspiracy on whiteboards. Red lines connected HOA boards to shell companies, property transfers to fraudulent assessments, creating a web of corruption that spanned communities and state lines. Your garage dispute was the thread that unraveled everything, AUSA Harrison explained, pointing to where my property sat at the center of the timeline. When they tried to seize private property so blatantly, they exposed their whole methodology. A junior prosecutor rushed in with breaking news. Sir, we just got a call from the Seattle field office. They've identified the same pattern in 12 communities there, all connected to shell companies registered to Diane Blackwood's extended family. The scope of the fraud was staggering. What had started as a simple property rights dispute had exposed a nationwide conspiracy of HOA board manipulation and real estate fraud. Kevin spread out his latest financial analysis. Look at the property value patterns. Every time they took control of an HOA board, property values would artificially drop in targeted areas. Their shell companies would buy at the bottom, then values would mysteriously recover once they flipped the properties. Market manipulation, Agent Torres mused. They weren't just stealing from individual homeowners, they were gaming entire local real estate markets. Through the conference room windows, we could see more residents arriving, clutching documents and photos, each with their own story of HOA abuse and fraudulent property transfers. Ray Martinez slipped into the room, his expression grim. Just got word from back home. They found a storage unit rented under David Walsh's name, full of original property deeds, altered board records, and what looks like blackmail material on half the state's real estate commissioners. The revelations kept coming. Each hour brought new evidence of how deep the corruption ran. Communities across the country had fallen victim to the same sophisticated scheme, their residents manipulated and exploited by seemingly legitimate HOA boards. A team of forensic accountants set up in an adjacent room, processing the flood of financial data. The numbers were astronomical. Millions in fraudulent assessments, property value manipulation, and illicit profits, all hidden behind a veneer of suburban governance. We're seeing a pattern with the targeted homeowners, Agent Torres noted, reviewing demographic data. Single parents, elderly residents, families with special needs children, people who couldn't easily fight back against board harassment. Mrs. Peterson arrived with more residents from our community, each carrying evidence of their own experiences with the corrupt board. The courthouse hallways filled with similar groups from other neighborhoods, all sharing eerily similar stories. They tried to force me out last year, an elderly gentleman from a nearby community explained. Suddenly, my yard was full of violations. My grandchildren weren't allowed to visit because they were too disruptive. Now I find out my neighbor's house was bought by one of their shell companies under the same circumstances. The grand jury testimony lasted hours. One by one, residents shared their experiences, building a comprehensive picture of systematic exploitation and fraud. Financial records revealed the intricate web of shell companies and fraudulent transactions. Security footage showed board members conducting unauthorized property inspections and surveillance. During a brief recess, Michael pulled me aside. The federal prosecutors are talking RICO charges now. This wasn't just fraud. It was an organized criminal enterprise operating under the guise of community governance. Patricia Whitmore emerged, from her testimony looking drained but relieved. They asked about every email, every board meeting, every special assessment. The prosecutors say my documentation provides a blueprint for investigating other communities. Outside the courthouse, news crews gathered as word spread about the scale of the investigation. Reporters cornered residents, eager for sound bites about suburban corruption and betrayed trust. The really insidious part, Kevin explained to a journalist, was how they used legitimate HOA functions to mask their criminal activities. Every community needs basic governance, maintenance, safety, community standards. They exploited that need to create a facade for their real estate fraud scheme. As the day wore on, more federal agents arrived with fresh evidence. A paper trail emerged, showing how the conspiracy had evolved over years, perfecting its methods of targeting vulnerable communities and manipulating property values. Your security cameras caught them in the act, Agent Torres noted. Most victims only had circumstantial evidence, but when they tried to seize your garage, they got sloppy, left a clear trail we could follow. The sun was setting by the time we finished for the day. In the courthouse parking lot, residents from different communities exchanged contact information and compared stories, forming an impromptu support network. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from other homeowners seeking advice on fighting their own HOA battles. The story had struck a nerve, revealing a widespread pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for too long. Ray waited by my car, scrolling through updates from back home. The interim board is working on new bylaws, complete transparency, proper oversight, regular audits, making sure this can't happen again. How are people holding up? I asked, still processing everything. But there's a silver lining. The community's actually coming together. Neighbors are talking, helping each other, getting involved in governance. Real community spirit, not the artificial version Diane used to talk about. As we drove home, past news vans still camped outside Oakridge Gardens, I reflected on how a simple stand for property rights had exposed such far-reaching corruption. My garage stood as a silent testament to the importance of standing up to abuse of power, no matter how small it might seem at first. Agent Torres had said it best during our final briefing. Sometimes the biggest criminals are the ones hiding in plain sight, using our own community structures against us. It takes one person willing to say no to expose the whole thing. That night, as residents gathered for another community meeting to discuss rebuilding their HOA from the ground up, the true impact of the garage dispute became clear. It wasn't just about private property rights anymore. It was about reclaiming our community from those who had exploited it for their own gain. And it all started with a simple refusal to let someone take what wasn't theirs to take. Federal agents swarmed through the Oakridge Gardens clubhouse, boxes of documents stacked on every surface. The community center had been transformed into a makeshift command post for what the media was now calling Operation HOA. Special Agent Torres directed her team with practiced efficiency as they catalogued evidence of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond our suburban enclave. "Take a look at this." Kevin O'Donnell called me over to a laptop displaying property records. "We found Diane's first attempt at this scheme. 15 years ago, different community, same pattern. She was testing the methodology even then. The screen showed familiar tactics, fraudulent assessments, targeted harassment, forced sales, but on a smaller scale, like watching a criminal enterprise in its infancy, learning from each success and failure." Michael Santos burst through the door, waving court documents. "They just seized another storage facility. You won't believe what they found." A team of agents wheeled in cart after cart of bankers' boxes. Inside were thousands of files, each documenting potential targets in communities across the country. Maps marked with highlighted properties, financial records of homeowners, surveillance, photos, a predator's catalogue of future victims. "They were planning to expand," Agent Torres explained, examining a detailed timeline. "Use the profits from existing schemes to take control of HOA boards in prime development areas, then manipulate property values to acquire entire blocks at below-market rates." Ray Martinez picked up a file with his neighborhood's name on it. "Look at these assessment projections. They were going to triple our fees next year, force out half the original homeowners." The scale of the prevented scheme was staggering. What had started as a dispute over my garage had derailed plans years in the making. Patricia Whitmore worked with federal forensic accountants, explaining the intricacies of how the board had hidden their activities. They buried the illegal transactions in legitimate maintenance contracts. Every real repair came with a ghost. Invoice for work that was never done. A commotion outside drew our attention. Through the clubhouse windows, we watched as agents led a handcuffed man toward a waiting FBI vehicle. I recognized him as Thomas Fuller, the county property assessor who had always seemed suspiciously quick to approve the board's valuations. "The corruption went deeper than we thought," Agent Torres noted. "They had people in county offices, banking, real estate, a whole network dedicated to facilitating their property schemes." Mrs. Peterson arrived with more residents, each carrying evidence they'd discovered while cleaning out the HOA office. 15 years of meticulous records documenting how the conspiracy had evolved and spread. "Found these in a hidden safe," she announced, spreading out photographs on a conference table. They were tracking potential targets in 5 more communities. Had everything planned down to which board members to compromise first. The images showed familiar patterns. Corner properties marked for acquisition, detailed notes on homeowners' financial vulnerabilities, even surveillance photos of community. Meetings where residents had questioned board decisions. Kevin's forensic team had set up multiple workstations, tracking money flows through a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. The really clever part was how they laundered the profits. Every fraudulent assessment, every undervalued property and purchase, the money would move through legitimate-looking renovation contracts before disappearing into their network of front companies. My phone buzzed with a message from the State Attorney General's office. They were expanding their investigation to include possible criminal negligence by the agencies that should have caught the fraud years ago. Your garage dispute created a domino effect, Michael observed, reviewing the growing list of indictments. Exposed the whole house of cards. Now every agency that looked the other way is scrambling to explain how they missed this. A young FBI analyst rushed in with fresh data. Found another pattern in the surveillance files. They were specifically targeting properties near planned development projects. Inside information about future zoning changes, infrastructure improvements. They were playing a long game, Agent Torres mused. Buy up strategic properties through forced sales, sit on them until development plans were announced, then sell at massive profits. Ray examined a map showing targeted properties across multiple communities. This wasn't just about stealing from homeowners. They were manipulating entire neighborhoods for future development schemes. Outside, more news vans arrived as word spread about the latest revelations. Reporters interviewed shell-shocked residents, each with their own story of how the corrupt board had impacted their lives. The really insidious part, Patricia explained to a journalist, was how they used legitimate community concerns to mask their criminal activities. Every repair request, every compliance issue became an opportunity for exploitation. Agent Torres gathered us for a briefing on the latest findings. We've identified similar operations in 3 more states. Same methodology, different figureheads, all connected through a web of shell companies and shared financial interests. The evidence room had become a testament to organized greed. Thousands of documents detailing how suburban governance had been twisted into a tool for systematic theft and manipulation. A team of federal prosecutors arrived to review the mounting evidence. The charges now went far beyond simple fraud or property theft. This was organized crime wearing a suburban mask. What amazes me, one prosecutor noted, is how long they got away with it. These weren't sophisticated criminals. They just counted on people being too busy or intimidated to question their authority. Mrs. Peterson touched my arm gently. If you hadn't stood up to them about your garage, they would have kept going, kept stealing homes, destroying lives, manipulating entire communities. The sun was setting when Agent Torres called everyone together for a final update. We're expanding the investigation to include financial institutions that facilitated these transactions. The rabbit hole keeps getting deeper. Michael was already preparing subpoenas for bank records. The money trail is leading to some very uncomfortable places, people in positions of power who should have noticed these patterns. As federal agents continued processing evidence, residents gathered in small groups, sharing stories and supporting each other. The community that Diane had tried to control through fear was finding its strength in unity. Ray joined me as I watched another box of evidence being catalogued. You know what's ironic? They could have kept their scheme running if they'd just left your garage alone. Got greedy, tried to grab too much, exposed their whole operation. Sometimes the biggest crimes are uncovered by the smallest details, Agent Torres commented. Passing by with more files, one person standing up to abuse of power can bring down an entire criminal enterprise. The night grew late, but the activity in the clubhouse didn't slow. Federal agents continued processing evidence while residents came and went, each bringing new pieces to the puzzle of how deeply the corruption had run. A message from the U.S. Attorney's Office confirmed what we already suspected. This case would lead to fundamental changes in how HOAs were regulated and overseen. What had started as a simple property dispute had exposed systemic vulnerabilities. In suburban governance, Kevin emerged from his analysis with fresh revelations. Found evidence of political contributions to local officials who blocked previous investigations. They were buying protection at every level. The implications were staggering. Not just a real estate fraud scheme, but a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had wrapped itself in the respectability of community governance. As I finally headed home that night, I passed my garage. The simple structure that had sparked this whole investigation, its security cameras still maintained their vigilant watch, a reminder that sometimes protecting your rights protects an entire community. Agent Torres had said it best during our final briefing. White-collar crime thrives on people's hesitation to question authority. All it takes is one person willing to say enough to expose the whole system of abuse. The floodlights cast long shadows across my driveway as I parked, illuminating the simple truth at the heart of this complex case. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest stands. The state capitol building seemed to loom larger than usual as we climbed its marble steps. State Senator James Morrison had requested our presence at an emergency oversight hearing. Though requested, felt more like summoned. The political fallout from Operation HOA was spreading, and powerful people were getting nervous. Agent Torres met us in the rotunda, her usual composed demeanor tinged with tension. We found connections to 3 state representatives and a dozen local officials. Campaign contributions, real estate deals, consulting contracts, all tied to Diane's network of shell companies. Michael Santos adjusted his tie as we walked toward the hearing room. They're trying to contain this before it exposes the whole system of political patronage. That's why this hearing was called so quickly. The chamber was already packed when we entered. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like watching eyes. Senator Morrison sat at the center of the elevated platform, flanked by committee members who seemed more interested in their phones than the proceedings. This hearing will come to order. Morrison's voice carried authority earned through decades in politics. We're here to investigate allegations of systematic fraud in homeowners associations across our state. Kevin O'Donnell set up his laptop, preparing to present the financial evidence we'd uncovered. Patricia Whitmore arranged her documents, hands steady despite the pressure. They'd both become experts at testifying over the past weeks. Before we begin, Morrison continued, I want to emphasize that this committee's goal is to prevent future abuses while maintaining the essential role of HOAs in community governance. Translation, they wanted to limit the damage without changing the system that had enabled it. The first hour was predictable, carefully scripted questions about specific incidents, avoiding any mention of political connections. Then Ray Martinez stepped up to testify, clutching a folder we hadn't seen before. I have here evidence of coordinated property acquisitions across 5 counties, Ray began. Each purchase coincides with undisclosed plans for major development. Projects that certain elected officials had advanced knowledge of through their committee positions. The chamber erupted in whispers. Morrison's face tightened almost imperceptibly. That's outside the scope of these hearings, he interrupted. We're focusing on HOA governance issues. With all due respect, Senator, Michael interjected, the exploitation of HOA governance for real estate fraud is directly connected to these development projects. Our evidence shows a clear pattern of inside information being used to target specific properties through fraudulent board actions. A junior committee member leaned forward. Could you elaborate on these connections? Morrison shot him a warning. Look, but the question had been asked. Kevin took over, projecting a complex web of transactions onto the chamber's screens. Here's the pattern. Board members would identify properties in areas slated for future development. They'd use fraudulent violations and assessments to force sales at below-market rates. Then, shell companies connected to political donors would acquire the properties, sitting on them until development plans were publicly announced. Pure speculation, Morrison dismissed, but his voice lacked conviction. Agent Torres stepped forward, badge visible on her belt. The FBI has documented over 50 instances of this pattern. In each case, the development plans were known to committee members months before public announcement. The cameras swiveled to capture Morrison's reaction. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. Patricia Whitmore opened her files. I have here emails between board members and legislative staffers coordinating property acquisitions with committee meeting schedules. Those documents weren't properly submitted, Morrison began, but Patricia continued. These emails show board members receiving advance notice of zoning changes, infrastructure projects, and development approvals. Information they used to target specific properties for their fraud scheme. The chamber had grown uncomfortably quiet. Committee members shifted in their seats, suddenly very interested in the proceedings. A side door opened and a group of suited individuals entered, taking positions along the wall. Federal prosecutors, their presence sending a clear message about the scope of the investigation. Senator, Michael spoke into the heavy silence. Would you care to explain why your wife's consulting firm received over $2 million in contracts from shell companies connected to these fraudulent property acquisitions? Morrison's face went pale. This hearing is adjourned. Actually, Senator, one of the federal prosecutors stepped forward. This hearing will continue. We have some questions about the relationship between legislative committees and certain real estate development interests. The next several hours exposed a web of corruption that went far beyond HOA fraud. Political connections had enabled and protected the scheme, while elected officials profited from insider knowledge of development plans. Mrs. Peterson, watching from the gallery, leaned forward to whisper, "All this because they tried to take your garage." The garage was just the thread that started unraveling the sweater, Agent Torres replied. Once we started pulling, the whole thing came apart. By evening, 3 committee members had recused themselves. 2 had requested legal representation, and Senator Morrison was facing calls for his resignation. Outside the Capitol, reporters swarmed as we emerged. The story had evolved from suburban fraud to political corruption, catching the national media's attention. The really tragic part, Kevin explained to a journalist, is how many small property owners were victimized while politicians looked the other way. People lost their homes so insiders could profit from development deals. Ray checked his phone as we walked to our cars. The interim board back home is getting flooded with calls from other communities. Everyone wants to know how to check their HOA records for similar patterns. Michael was already preparing subpoenas for the next phase of investigation. This is going to lead to major changes in how development projects are approved. Too many people got rich exploiting inside information. Agent Torres gathered us for a final update. We're expanding the investigation to include legislative staff and committee records. The corruption went deeper into the political system than anyone suspected. The sun was setting behind the Capitol dome as we drove home, its golden light a stark contrast to the dark revelations of the day. My garage, the simple structure that had started this cascade of exposures, stood as a testament to the importance of standing up to corruption, no matter how powerful the forces behind it. That night, as news broadcasts detailed the political earthquake our investigation had triggered, I received a message from Agent Torres. Your refusal to back down did more than protect your property rights. It exposed a system of corruption that was hurting communities across the state. The next morning brought news of emergency legislative sessions, ethics investigations, and a growing list of officials facing scrutiny over their connections to fraudulent development deals. Ray Martinez summed it up best. Sometimes protecting your own small piece of property ends up protecting everyone's rights. Funny how that works. As federal agents continued combing through political connections and development deals, the true scope of what we'd uncovered became clear. This wasn't just about HOA fraud or property rights anymore. It was about the corruption of the very systems meant to protect community interests. A simple garage dispute had exposed the rot at the heart of suburban governance, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Inside the makeshift command center that had once been my garage, FBI analysts hunched over laptops while residents filtered in and out, each bringing new pieces of evidence. Agent Torres had suggested using my now famous garage as their base of operations, a decision that carried more than a touch of irony. "Found another connection," Kevin announced, waving me over to his workstation. "Remember the Henderson family who were forced out last year? Their property was purchased by a shell company owned by Senator Morrison's chief of staff's wife." Agent Torres examined the documentation. The timing matches perfectly with the announcement of the new highway interchange. Property value tripled. Once the plans went public, Michael Santos arrived with fresh court orders. "Just got approval to access sealed divorce records. Turns out our friend Diane Blackwood had quite the interesting alimony arrangement with several judges who blocked previous investigations." A moving truck passed by outside, belonging to another board member quietly leaving town ahead of pending indictments. The exodus had begun as more officials realized the extent of the investigation. Mrs. Peterson entered, carrying a stack of old community newsletters. "You need to see these." Every time they announced a special assessment, it coincided with private meetings between board members and development companies. The newsletters painted a picture of calculated manipulation. Each announcement of community improvements masked a deeper scheme to force out targeted homeowners. "Classic misdirection," Agent Torres noted. "Use legitimate community needs as cover for fraudulent activities. Make anyone who questions the assessments look like they're against neighborhood improvement." Ray Martinez arrived with more residents, each carrying evidence they'd discovered while reviewing their personal records. The garage had become a clearinghouse for community members sharing their experiences. "Listen to this," Ray said, playing a recording from his phone. "Board meeting from 2 years ago. Diane's discussing future development plans for the east side of the neighborhood. Months before those plans were made public, the recording revealed casual mentions of property, acquisitions, special assessments, and strategic violations, all discussed as if exploiting homeowners was simply business as usual. Patricia Whitmore worked nearby, organizing evidence for the growing civil suit. The pattern becomes clear when you see it all together. Every major development project was preceded by targeted harassment of property owners in the affected areas. A young FBI analyst rushed in with printouts, found something in the shell company registrations. The same law firm handled all the incorporations, and they're connected to the State Commerce Committee chairman. The web of corruption seemed to grow with each new revelation. What had started as a property rights dispute had exposed decades of systematic exploitation. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Another political resignation, this time a county commissioner who had approved suspicious property transfers connected to the scheme. "They're running scared," Michael observed. "Everyone who helped enable this fraud is trying to distance themselves before the full investigation becomes public." Outside, a group of residents had gathered on my driveway, sharing stories of their experiences with the corrupt board. The garage that Diane had tried to seize had become a symbol of resistance against institutional abuse. Mrs. O'Donnell, an elderly resident who had nearly lost her home to fraudulent violations, approached with tears in her eyes. I kept all their threatening letters. Didn't know why at the time, but something told me to document everything. Her documentation revealed a calculated campaign of harassment, violations appearing immediately after she refused to sell, fines multiplying without explanation, selective enforcement of rules that didn't apply to other residents. Agent Torres added the letters to their evidence files. This is the human cost of their scheme. They weren't just stealing property. They were destroying people's sense of security in their own homes. A reporter from the national news arrived, seeking interviews about the growing scandal. The story had evolved from local corruption to a nationwide examination of HOA abuse. The really insidious part, Kevin explained to the journalist, was how they used legitimate community governance structures to mask criminal activities. People trusted their HOA board to act in the community's interest. Ray checked his tablet, scanning community message boards. Similar stories are coming out across the country. Other neighborhoods recognizing the same patterns we exposed here. Michael was already preparing documentation for a nationwide class action suit. This could fundamentally change how HOAs operate. More oversight, stricter regulations, real consequences for abuse of power. Agent Torres received a call that made her expression darken. Just got word some of the targeted residents from other communities committed suicide after losing their homes. This wasn't just fraud, people's lives were destroyed. The garage fell silent as the human cost of the corruption sank in. These weren't just property crimes or financial schemes. Real people had suffered devastating consequences. Mrs. Peterson touched my arm gently. If you hadn't stood up to them about your garage, how many more people would they have hurt? A federal prosecutor arrived with new subpoenas. We're going after the enablers now. Banks that approved suspicious loans, title companies that processed fraudulent transfers, officials who looked the other way. Outside, more news vans had arrived as word spread about the latest developments. The garage had become ground zero for exposing systematic abuse of community governance. The thing is, Ray observed, watching the activity, none of this would have come to light if they'd just respected private property rights. Their own greed exposed everything. Kevin emerged from his analysis with fresh revelations, found evidence of similar schemes dating back 20 years. Different players, same methodology, use HOA authority to force property transfers, profit from inside information about development plans. Agent Torres gathered everyone for an update. We're seeing this pattern replicated across the country. HOA boards being used as tools for real estate fraud and political corruption. The sun was setting when Patricia discovered something in an old email chain. Look at this. They were targeting specific demographics: single parents, elderly residents, families with special needs children, people they thought wouldn't have the resources to fight back. The evidence painted a picture of calculated predation. The corrupt board hadn't just exploited their authority, they had deliberately targeted the most vulnerable members of the community. Michael reviewed the growing list of charges. This goes beyond fraud or corruption. This was organized criminal activity masquerading as community governance. As night fell, residents continued arriving with their stories and evidence. The garage that had sparked this investigation had become a symbol of community empowerment and resistance against institutional abuse. Agent Torres summed it up best. Sometimes it takes one person standing firm on principle to expose an entire system of corruption. Your garage dispute didn't just protect your property rights, it gave voice to victims across the country. The floodlights cast long shadows as I stood in my driveway, watching federal agents process evidence of crimes that stretched far beyond our suburban community. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest stands, and a simple garage could become the catalyst for national reform. 6 months after the garage dispute that exposed a nationwide corruption scheme, I stood in the federal courthouse watching as Diane Blackwood received her sentence. 45 years in federal prison, restitution orders exceeding $50 million, and the permanent forfeiture of all assets acquired through her criminal enterprise. Agent Torres sat beside me, her usually stern expression softened by satisfaction. The judge made an example of her. This sentence will send shockwaves through corrupt HOA boards across the country. Behind us, the gallery was packed with residents from communities across 3 states, each bearing witness to justice finally being served. Mrs. Peterson clutched her handkerchief as the judge read out the litany of crimes: wire fraud, racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, and dozens of other charges. Kevin O'Donnell leaned forward, whispering, "She doesn't look so intimidating. Now does she? Amazing how power crumbles when the truth comes out." Indeed, Diane's carefully cultivated image of suburban authority had vanished. Without her designer suits and artificial smile, she seemed smaller, diminished by the weight of her exposed crimes. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. "This case represents one of the most egregious abuses of community trust this court has ever seen. The systematic exploitation of homeowners through fraudulent governance must serve as a wake-up call for regulatory reform." Michael Santos was already preparing documents for the next phase: civil suits against the enablers who had facilitated the scheme. Banks, title companies, corrupt officials, everyone who had profited from the exploitation would face consequences. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Residents from affected communities held signs demanding justice and reform. National news crews jostled for position, their cameras capturing the moment corruption in suburban governance faced real accountability. Ray Martinez organized a group of former victims, now turned activists. "We're not just getting justice, we're changing the system. New state laws requiring HOA oversight, federal regulations on property transfers, criminal penalties for board, misconduct." Patricia Whitmore, who had once trembled at Diane's presence, now stood confidently before the cameras, explaining how the corruption had been exposed and documenting the changes already taking place in communities across the country. "The new transparency laws are just the beginning," she explained to reporters. "Real-time auditing of HOA finances, independent oversight of board decisions, protections for homeowners who report misconduct. Everything we wished we'd had before." Back in Oakridge Gardens, the transformation was visible. The community center, once Diane's seat of power, had been renovated into a resident resource center. Homeowners gathered there freely, participating in genuine community governance. The interim board, elected with unprecedented resident participation, had implemented every reform promised. Financial records were publicly accessible, board meetings were streamed live, and every decision faced rigorous community review. Mrs. O'Donnell, who had nearly lost her home to the corrupt board, now chaired the Resident Advocacy Committee. "We're not just protecting property rights," she explained. "We're rebuilding trust, showing how community governance should really work." The garage that had started it all had become something of a local landmark. Residents would stop by, sharing stories of how the exposure of corruption had affected their lives, their communities, their faith in local governance. Agent Torres received updates from field offices across the country. Similar schemes were being uncovered and shut down, corrupt board members facing federal charges, stolen properties being returned to rightful owners. "Your stand created a ripple effect," she noted. "Communities everywhere are examining their HOA practices, demanding accountability, refusing to accept abuse of power as normal." Kevin's forensic team had trained resident volunteers in financial oversight, creating a network of watchdogs across suburban communities. "Never again," he promised. "No one should lose their home to fraudulent governance." The federal investigation had exposed over 300 corrupt HOA boards nationwide, leading to emergency reforms in 27 states. Property rights legislation sparked by our case was moving through Congress. Michael Santos reviewed the final settlement figures. Over $2 billion in restitution ordered, thousands of fraudulent property transfers reversed, hundreds of corrupt officials facing charges. But the real victory, he observed, is the change in community consciousness. People understanding their rights, standing up to abuse, refusing to be intimidated by false authority. Mrs. Peterson organized community education sessions, teaching residents about property rights, governance oversight, and the importance of active participation in their HOA. Knowledge is power, she would say. When we understand our rights, when we work together, no one can exploit our community again. The sun set over Oakridge Gardens, casting long shadows across my garage, the simple structure that had sparked a national movement for reform. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest stands, when someone simply says no to injustice. As residents gathered for another community meeting, I watched them enter the resource center with confidence, unafraid to speak up, to question, to participate in genuine community governance. Ray Martinez organized a group of former victims, now turned activists. We're not just getting justice, we're changing the system. New state laws requiring HOA oversight, federal regulations on property transfers, criminal penalties for board, misconduct. Patricia Whitmore, who had once trembled at Diane's presence, now stood confidently before the cameras, explaining how the corruption had been exposed and documenting the changes already taking place in communities across the country. The new transparency laws are just the beginning, she explained to reporters. Real-time auditing of HOA finances, independent oversight of board decisions, protections for homeowners who report misconduct, everything we wished we'd had before. Back in Oakridge Gardens, the transformation was visible. The community center, once Diane's seat of power, had been renovated into a resident resource center. Homeowners gathered there freely, participating in genuine community governance. The interim board, elected with unprecedented resident participation, had implemented every reform promised. Financial records were publicly accessible. Board meetings were streamed live, and every decision faced rigorous community review. Mrs. O'Donnell, who had nearly lost her home to the corrupt board, now chaired the Resident Advocacy Committee. We're not just protecting property rights, she explained. We're rebuilding trust, showing how community governance should really work. The garage that had started it all had become something of a local landmark. Residents would stop by, sharing stories of how the exposure of corruption had affected their lives, their communities, their faith in local governance. Agent Torres received updates from field offices across the country. Similar schemes were being uncovered and shut down, corrupt board members facing federal charges, stolen properties being returned to rightful owners. Your stand created a ripple effect, she noted. Communities everywhere are examining their HOA practices, demanding accountability, refusing to accept abuse of power as normal. Kevin's forensic team had trained resident volunteers in financial oversight, creating a network of watchdogs across suburban communities. Never again, he promised. No one should lose their home to fraudulent governance. The federal investigation had exposed over 300 corrupt HOA boards nationwide, leading to emergency reforms in 27 states. Property rights legislation, sparked by our case, was moving through Congress. Michael Santos reviewed the final settlement figures. Over $2 billion in restitution ordered, thousands of fraudulent property transfers reversed, hundreds of corrupt officials facing charges. But the real victory, he observed, is the change in community consciousness. People understanding their rights, standing up to abuse, refusing to be intimidated by false authority. Mrs. Peterson organized community education sessions, teaching residents about property rights, governance oversight, and the importance of active participation in their HOA. Knowledge is power, she would say. When we understand our rights, when we work together, no one can exploit our community again. The sun set over Oakridge Gardens, casting long shadows across my garage. The simple structure that had sparked a national movement for reform. Sometimes, the biggest changes start with the smallest stands, when someone simply says no to injustice. As residents gathered for another community meeting, I watched them enter the resource center with confidence, unafraid to speak up, to question, to participate in genuine community governance. Ray Martinez summed it up perfectly. One person protecting their property rights became thousands, protecting their communities. That's how real change happens. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.